Ray Dalio, is there something that the West misunderstands about Chinese markets? And does that, of course, exacerbate the volatility we saw over the last 2 weeks?
I think there's a lot that the West misunderstands about the Chinese markets, but I think the essence of what's going on in China is an adjustment, four major challenges. They have a debt restructuring challenge. They have an economic restructuring challenge, so they have to come up with a new model for the economy. They have a capital markets challenge to build the capital markets in an efficient way so that it circulates capital through the system better. And right now they have also a balance of payments challenge having to do with the pressure on the currency, the capital outflows, and those types of things. These are things that have happened repeatedly through the rest of the world. The United States has had three major debt crises. We couldn't pay our debts in 1971. We had it in 1982. We had a debt crisis. We had the S&L crisis. We've reshaped our economy many times. I remember when the steel industry ended and heavy manufacturing, and we've gone into other areas. We've had a number of balance of payments and currency issues. So I think that maybe one of the things that is being misunderstood is what is a normal balance of payments, economic, too much debt restructuring kind of recession. In Japan, they used to define a recession as anything less than 3% growth. Maybe in China, they'll describe a recession as less than 5% growth. We're going through that. I think it's being confused with the longer-term picture. In other words, I think that the reforms that are going on in China and the leadership in China in terms of where it's moving is going to be very fundamentally good. And so you're looking at something that is a short-term challenge as distinct from something of where we will be in 5 years after the regeneration of new capital markets and new economy with vibrant young entrepreneurs and that other economy that's now beginning to flourish.
But why have we had so much volatility since the start of the year? Well,
the volatility has been primarily as a result of, in the world as a whole, that we have an easing of monetary policy all around the world. And we're not going to have the same effectiveness in that easing of monetary policy. Because with interest rates at zero, you can't cut interest rates. And with asset prices having risen because of that quantitative easing, there is risk, the risk premiums have gone down, and there's a big vulnerability. So when China is dealing with the rest of the world, China is a negative on the margin for the rest of the world. And the world is vulnerable because of the lack of monetary policy, while asset prices are comparatively high. I think that the Chinese policymakers are not getting nearly as much credit as they deserve. And I have the benefit of seeing it from the outside, so I'm not speaking from a Chinese perspective. I think you have to get into the nitty-gritty of what they're going through. So let's say a debt restructuring. If you take a look at the debt restructuring that they're having to go through, just to put that in perspective, local government spending counts for about 30% of GDP. It's running a deficit, funding deficit, of about 20%. That means if you cut that funding deficit, that's about 6% of GDP, a hacking of 6% GDP. If you look at the way that that has been restructured, and managed. It's been managed really superbly. It's a very difficult situation because you're in a situation where if you just restructure and you don't provide those capital, all of that spending that is taking place through there won't take place. So, and the same people who are doing that restructuring are the same people who did it in '98 with Zhurongji. They're the same experienced people. If you know the mechanisms, the type of mechanisms literally to be using these things, they're pursuing that. If you look at the economic restructuring, in other words, they're going from one economy. Basically, it was like 5 banks, lends to state-owned enterprises, and lends to local governments. Okay, the development of a shadow lending system, that's been done with a lot of balance. Because, in other words, it's a risky situation, but the free exchange of capital in a certain way is getting capital to companies that never would have had access to capital before. And that's not producing a volatility. That's quite an accomplishment. And if you look at, okay, the balance of payments. The balance of payments is a very difficult situation. Capital flows are what the capital flows are. And if you look at how they're handling it, I think in terms of the stock market handling it, there have been problems. And some of the responses have not been by world standards. But there was also a big order imbalance. In other words, when the order hit and everybody wants to sell, and then they have to respond quickly, there was that sort of circumstances. When I speak to those policymakers and I speak to those in the West, I find equal levels of, or even better sometimes, equal levels of competence in terms of dealing with the things that they're dealing with. I would say that if you compare also the politics of the government, there are no loose cannons that are going to be running China. I mean, these are people, if you look at the system of how it has to be chosen and how you get to there, you have to be a competent leader and devoted to the country. If you look at the politics in the West, and we look at some of the leadership there, that could be quite scary. So I think this commitment, I think the commitment to market reforms is a very real commitment to market reforms. In other words, and think of the power that that's going to have to liberalize that economy. Basically, it's been an economy with the money clogged at the top. Top 10% is where it's passing through. This will circulate, and there's a new China. You could speak to that new China, the new board, and the entrepreneurship. So I think we're going through a cyclical, you can't help but go over that cyclical adjustment. And that'll last probably maybe 2 or 3 years. It comes at a bad time for the rest of the world, because when you look at its impact on commodity prices, and then not only just commodity prices, the other economies of Brazil and so on, and you look at the vulnerability of the rest of the world in terms of monetary policy, that's a bad combination. But we'll get past this, I think, in terms of China. A bad year in China is going to be a great year in almost any other country. As was said, the leverage levels are not intolerably high. The problem is that debt is still growing at a rate that's significantly faster than income. That's an unsustainable circumstance. It's also an understandable circumstance because changing that rate abruptly will have a negative effect on the economy. I think the issue of instability is more of a balance of payments currency issue. That becomes one that I'm more concerned about. That might require more of an adjustment in the currency, and that adjustment in the currency would have an effect on the rest of the world, which would also transmit deflationary pressures to the rest of the world, because those exchange rates would essentially appreciate. And that has an effect at a time when there is a weakness in the rest of the world. We have to look at the impact that China has on the rest of the world and the rest of the world has on China, and the fact that there's not much of an effectiveness in monetary policy. Those two things combined create for a risky situation.